The Patterson family farm was known for its rich soil and bountiful harvests, but there was something unsettling about the land. The locals whispered about strange happenings after dark, crops that grew too quickly, and the eerie glow that sometimes radiated from the cornfields. But the Pattersons always dismissed the stories, chalking them up to old superstitions. That fall, however, things took a dark turn. As the harvest season began, John Patterson noticed something unusual in the fields. The corn had grown taller than ever before, unnaturally tall, with stalks bending as if they were weighed down by something hidden among them. One evening, as he prepared to finish the day's work, John saw movement deep within the rows of corn. He figured it was just some animals, but when the rustling grew louder and more erratic, he grabbed his flashlight and ventured in. The thick stalks seemed to close in behind him, cutting off the light from the setting sun. The air grew cold, and the familiar scent of earth turned foul, like something rotting beneath the soil. He called out, thinking it might be one of his sons playing a trick, but there was no response. Just the rustle of corn. Then, he heard it, a low, rasping voice, almost like a whisper carried by the wind, calling his name. John. He froze. His heart pounded in his chest as the whispering grew louder, more urgent. Shadows seemed to move between the rows, and out of the corner of his eye, he saw a figure, tall and thin, its limbs bent at odd angles, like a scarecrow that had come to life. Its hollow eyes locked onto him, and its smile, if you could call it that, stretched too wide, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. John stumbled back, but the corn seemed to part for the creature, allowing it to draw closer. He turned and ran, the flashlight bouncing in his hand, casting wild, flickering shadows. The whispers were everywhere now, surrounding him, growing louder and louder until they were deafening. He crashed through the rows of corn, finally breaking free of the field and collapsing onto the dirt road. Breathless, John looked back. The creature stood just at the edge of the field, its long fingers wrapped around the stalks. It tilted its head, watching him, as if waiting. That night, John told his wife, Clara, about what he had seen. She tried to calm him down, saying it must have been his imagination, that he had worked too hard. But deep down, she knew something was wrong with the farm. The next day, John found strange markings in the soil, like clawed footprints, leading deeper into the cornfield. His sons, eager to help, went to investigate despite his warnings. Hours passed, and when they didn't return, John's dread grew. As evening fell, he ventured back into the fields with Clara, calling for their boys. The corn whispered back, rustling softly, as if the land itself had swallowed them. They found no sign of their children, only the same eerie glow and the unsettling silence. Suddenly, Clara gasped and pointed to something moving through the corn. It was their sons, or what looked like them. But their faces were blank, their eyes empty. They moved unnaturally, their limbs stiff and jerky. Behind them, the creature from the night before emerged, its smile wider than ever. The harvest demands a sacrifice, it whispered in a voice that chilled John to his bones. Before he could react, the creature's long arms reached out, pulling Clara and their sons into the corn. Their screams were cut off abruptly, swallowed by the field. John stood frozen, unable to move, as the creature turned to him one last time, whispering, "You're next." He ran, abandoning the farm, the fields, and everything he had ever known. But the shadows followed him. No matter how far he went, he could still hear the whispers, calling him back to the cursed land. And every fall, when the harvest moon rose, he knew the farm was waiting for its final sacrifice. The old farmhouse sat at the edge of the woods, shrouded in mist and decay. No one in the nearby town dared go near it. Rumor had it the place was cursed, ever since Old Man Turner vanished without a trace 20 years ago. They said he had dabbled in dark magic, trying to protect his crops from a strange blight that destroyed everything in its path. But whatever he summoned wasn't just after the crops. It was after him. One evening, a young couple, Jake and Emily, driving through the countryside, noticed their car sputtering and dying on the road. Desperate for help, They saw the silhouette of the farmhouse through the thick fog. They approached, unaware of the warnings that surrounded it. The door creaked open on its own as they knocked. Inside, the air was thick, and the smell of rot filled their lungs. Faint whispers echoed from the shadows, calling their names. But there was no one there, just dusty old furniture and tools long forgotten. Suddenly, they heard the sound of footsteps overhead. Jake grabbed a rusty lantern from the wall, and they cautiously made their way up the stairs. The atmosphere grew heavier, each step pulling them deeper into the house's eerie grip. At the end of the hallway, a door slowly opened, revealing a small room with strange symbols carved into the wooden floor. In the center stood a scarecrow, worn and tattered, but something about it felt alive. Its eyes, dull black beads, seemed to follow their every movement. Emily backed away, her breath shallow, but Jake, driven by curiosity, reached out to touch it. The scarecrow's hand shot up, grabbing his wrist with inhuman strength. Its head twisted toward him, and a voice that wasn't its own echoed through the room. "He promised us more souls." The house began to shake. The walls groaned as unseen forces clawed at them. Emily screamed as Jake was dragged into the darkness, his body contorting unnaturally as the scarecrow consumed him. She ran, but the farmhouse twisted, the hallways stretching and warping, leading her deeper into the nightmare. Outside, the townspeople heard the distant scream, but turned away. Another soul had been claimed by the cursed land. The farmhouse would wait for the next unlucky traveler. The Miller family had always struggled to keep their farm afloat. Year after year, the crops withered, and no matter how hard they worked, the soil seemed cursed. Desperate to save the land, Daniel Miller hired a new farmhand, a quiet man named Elias. He came out of nowhere, offering his services for next to nothing. His only condition? No one was to enter the barn at night. Elias worked miracles. The crops flourished under his care, growing taller and healthier than ever before. Livestock multiplied, the fields were green, and the once failing farm was thriving. The townsfolk were amazed at the sudden turnaround, but some whispered about Elias, wondering where he had come from and how he could be so skilled. Months passed, and the Millers' lives seemed perfect. But there was one strange thing. Each night, Elias would disappear into the barn, locking the door behind him. Daniel, curious but respecting the farmhand's wishes, ignored it for a while. But as time went on, strange sounds began to emanate from the barn. At first, it was faint scratching, like something trying to escape. Then came the whispers, soft, unintelligible voices in the dead of night. One evening, unable to resist any longer, Daniel decided to investigate. He waited until everyone in the house was asleep, then crept out into the cold night. As he approached the barn, the whispers grew louder, but there was something else, a low, rhythmic chanting, like a ritual. His heart raced as he pressed his ear to the heavy wooden door. Inside, Elias was speaking in a language Daniel didn't understand, his voice low and unnerving. Through the cracks in the door, Daniel caught glimpses of strange symbols painted in blood on the floor, forming a circle around something large and unnatural. The air inside the barn shimmered as if reality itself was warping, bending around the figure at the center. Daniel's stomach twisted as he realized what he was looking at. A grotesque creature, a monstrous thing with twisted limbs and glowing eyes, its body pulsating with a sickly green light. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, a nightmare made flesh. The creature was feeding on something, and as Daniel looked closer, he saw what it was. Small bundles of hay and corn husks, arranged like human forms, twisted and broken. His breath caught in his throat. Elias was summoning something, using the farm itself as a sacrifice to some ancient, dark force. The bounty, the flourishing crops, everything came at a price. Daniel stumbled backward, his mind reeling. He had to stop Elias before it was too late. He rushed back to the house, grabbing his rifle and waking his wife, Sarah. Together, they stormed toward the barn, intent on confronting the farmhand and ending whatever dark magic was at play. When they burst through the doors, Elias was waiting, his face calm, almost serene. The creature behind him lurked in the shadows, its glowing eyes watching them with hunger. "You shouldn't have come here, Daniel," Elias said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The land required something in return for its bounty.
Blood. Flesh.
"You wouldn't understand." Daniel raised his rifle, but before he could fire, the creature lunged forward, its massive limbs stretching out and wrapping around him. It lifted him into the air, its touch cold and suffocating. Sarah screamed, but Elias simply watched, his face emotionless. "This is how the farm thrives," Elias continued, his voice distant. "A sacrifice every season. The crops grow because the land is fed." The creature's grip tightened, and Daniel felt his body begin to break, the air crushed from his lungs. The last thing he saw before darkness consumed him was Sarah's face, twisted in horror, as she tried to escape the barn. But there was no escape. The next day, the townsfolk noticed the millers were missing. The farm stood eerily quiet, the barn doors wide open, but no one dared to enter. The crops still grew tall, the livestock grazed peacefully, and the farm looked as prosperous as ever. Weeks later, a new family moved in. The farmhand, Elias, greeted them with a friendly smile, offering his services once more. And so, the cycle continued. The land always demanded its due.